Welcome everyone. This is another in the continuing fall lecture series on transportation policy and planning, supported by the UCLA Institute of Transportation Studies. Our speaker today is interested in keeping her carbon footprint as low as possible. Is Kockelman. She is the Dewitt C. Greer Centennial Professor in Transportation Engineering at the University of Texas at Austin. She's one of the nation's leading experts on the policy and planning implications of shared autonomous vehicles, and we're very lucky to have her speaking to us today. Her research has also addressed statistical modeling of urban systems, energy and climate issues, economic impacts of transport policy, and crash occurrence and consequences. Professor Kockelman is a registered professional engineer and holds a PhD and bachelor's in civil engineering, a master of city and regional planning, and a minor in economics, all from UC Berkeley, which is one of the branch campuses to the north of UCLA. And she's a prolific scholar. She's authored over 150 scholarly publications in her 21 years at Austin and a bit before. Today, she's going to be speaking to us remotely on anticipating a world of automated transport, opportunities for vehicle and ride-sharing systems. Please join me in sort of welcoming Professor Kockelman to UCLA remotely.
Thanks so much, you guys. I really appreciate you allowing me to lower my carbon footprint and teach my class tomorrow morning. I know you guys are all busy with classes, and so are we here. So it really is a win-win. But I know we can't have those one-on-one meetings before or after today's seminar, so please call me or email me, and let's set up a time to chat, you know, via Skype or just via regular phone whenever you guys have questions. It's not a problem for me at all. Brian, I really appreciate your allowing me to do this remotely. I hope this saves you guys some time and money as well, and you can put that towards student needs. So I'm going to start sharing my screen here on a slideshow that I've given around the world, although I do add and let's see. Here we go. You guys able to see that all right? I assume so. You guys are muted, so I can't hear you at all, but Whitney can unmute you at any point to ask questions. So obviously, self-driving vehicles are very exciting and important and transformative for transportation. And so my students and I have been doing work in this area for quite a few years. Actually, our work started with a student-led paper for the ENO Transportation Center, which is in DC. And it's a terrific group, and I encourage you to get involved with it. And I believe Dr. Taylor has been quite involved with ENO over the years as well. And so that really kicked off. I didn't have research funding, so that's why it was kind of a low budget affair, but ended up having a lot of impact because it is such an important topic, and relatively few people, you know, were looking into it from our angle, which is more of a planning angle and a behavioral angle. And since then, I've had lots of students. So Dan was that first student, and then Donna Chen, who now teaches at the University of Virginia, Ben Lowe, who does planning for Philadelphia, Neil, who works here in Austin on transportation issues, and Murti, who is still a graduate student, a doctoral student here. But there's many others that have written papers, and I just don't have time to share all that with you, so I'm going to have to streamline it to two major topic areas. One is the data collection and interpretation that we use to kind of forecast the future of the fleet and the use of that fleet in self-driving or electric mode, for example, not just conventional driving on conventional drivetrains. And then the simulations of the shared fleets and how that would work serving lots of different trip types across progressively bigger regions. So we started small, and then we eventually found code that we could work with that would allow us to simulate much larger regions. And so we relied on that code, which had been coded by computer scientists rather than transportation engineers. So it worked a lot faster for much bigger scale. So the part one is that data acquisition. And we've done 5 surveys now. I'm just going to tell you about one of them. This was for the National Science Foundation. And so it wasn't just looking at self-driving and shared systems of vehicles, but also electric drivetrains, which is really important for the decarbonization that we obviously need, which is one of the reasons I'm not traveling to UCLA today in person. So this one is back in the spring of 2017. It's almost 1,500 complete responses. These are 70-question surveys, so they're kind of long, and there is a bias towards more educated people, as well as women, I think. I think there was kind of a heavy bias. It's interesting to me, because it is a technology survey, but it bumps back and forth depending on which survey. In this case, we had strong response from women, highly educated, because it's easier to get through those long surveys. So we end up weighting the responses to be able to report the results and run the regression models that give us the parameters that we need to simulate the fleet evolution and how households behave in the future. So that's all corrected basically for basic demographics on education, household size, vehicle ownership, income, and perhaps, yeah, gender for sure. But each of these respondents is basically reflecting an entire household. So they're speaking for a household worth of vehicles. And we ask them about current vehicles and ages and styles of vehicle, and then the coming choices about letting go of vehicles, possibly acquiring new or used ones, leasing or renting, and whether they'd be electric, depending on pricing, whether they might be self-driving, or whether they might let go of some vehicle ownership or rely more and more on shared fleets, as well as shared rides. So that's really important to reducing congestion as well as reducing emissions. And we call that dynamic ride sharing. So you're going to see the acronym DRS a fair bit, as well as the SAVs, which I hope you know is shared autonomous vehicles. And then electric vehicles is EVs, and connected and automated vehicles. So connection's pretty cheap. It's the automation that's expensive and difficult to achieve. So lots of questions being asked. We have these respondents across the continental US and as well as, of course, Puerto Rico, Hawaii, and then Alaska, not shown on this map. And we ask them basic questions like, after these are corrected percentages, but what would who among them do they think would be having a vehicle that has autonomous capabilities on their next vehicle if there's no price difference? So only about a third of American households are ready for that, it seems. And of course, there is a big price difference, and they're not available in the showrooms. The price difference would be massive right now if they wanted to sell to a private household. We asked them about having both modes of driving. So human driving, we call it a human-driven vehicle, and you can have a dual-mode vehicle. So much like Tesla sort of allows you to shift between different levels of autonomy or automation, I should say. They do not have a self-driving vehicle there, although some people, do rely on it way too much and treat it as almost a self-driving vehicle on freeways. And if a vehicle had both those capabilities, on average, the American household is willing to do about a third of their travel in self-driving mode, which is strange. I would be much higher on that percentage, but of course, I'm a really busy person. I have kids, I have a pretty intense job, and you guys are very busy too, so I suspect many of you would be willing to rely on that AV mode, especially at lower speeds where there's less likelihood of your dying. But of course, people outside the vehicle are very vulnerable. So hitting others is something that we don't pay as much attention to as we should when we make decisions about our driving. The willingness to pay, so the WTP for the full self-driving technology on a vehicle is about $1,000 higher per vehicle if the vehicle has that dual mode capability, so that the person can still shift to human driving, and maybe they don't like how the vehicle drives when it's in autonomous mode. Maybe they don't trust it at high speeds, or they really like to maintain their driving capabilities, or they really like driving in the hills, on a weekend, something like that. So really depends on the context, and American households at this time, on average $1,000 higher, but some households, of course, are willing to pay $20,000 more right now for that capability for full automation, and then perhaps to maintain that capability, because some people really do not want to have a self-driving vehicle. It's just too scary. We also asked them about the self-driving, the shared mode. And so this is like an Uber or a Lyft vehicle. And of course, Uber and Lyft are charging about $2 per mile right now on average. And so we bring that cost down because there isn't the cost of the driver. There is the cost of the technology and the maintenance of that fleet, of course. And so we asked them if people will still use private cars. We have lots of examples, and these are just, you know, weighted population corrected percentages, and you'll see that row at the bottom where many households still in the US are saying, no, I'm not going to get a self-driving vehicle, even if it's just for one short trip. I really am going to just rely almost exclusively on personal vehicles and existing modes. But we do see, you know, depending on the price, we see some households shifting perhaps largely to the shared AV mode. We asked them their willingness to pay for those SAVs. So some people are willing to pay $0. They don't want it, but on average, it's about 44 cents a mile, which is really close to the price that another student, Ben Loeb, and I estimated to be the cost of providing such a service with a hybrid electric vehicle drivetrain. So not a fully self-driving, and you don't have to buy all the charging infrastructure. You can rely on existing gasoline stations. But that assumption that you'll see later in this presentation does mean that the price differential for a self-driving car is just $15,000 to $20,000. So not a huge price difference in when we got it down to 45 cents a mile, and that would be without profit. So you know, Uber and Lyft are, even though they don't make money right now, they do hope to make money in the future, as do Ford and Enterprise and a lot of other market participants that could easily manage such a system if they had access to the vehicles. So about half say they would be willing to select dynamic ride sharing, not on all their trips, but on some of their trips, assuming that it's, you know, significantly discounted, just like Uber Pool and Lyft Line are. And if you do have that 40% discount in place, only about 20% of the rides would be in that sharing mode where you have, you know, a stranger in the car with you, somebody who's maybe going to this a similar destination or from a similar origin in a similar direction. So I bet many of you have shared rides, and I think for me it's been a very positive experience. I haven't done it late at night in some lonely rural location, but you know, and I've always had a driver in there, so we've always had a third party. But they can have cameras and other things to help get that percentage up, because 19% is pretty sad. We want to see that be much higher given the current vehicle occupancy rates that we have on the road. And the fact that SAVs do have to drive empty a lot of the time to go pick up their next passenger. So we'll be talking about that in a second when we get to part 2 and part 3 of this presentation. So we do expect some people to maybe drive downtown more often because they don't have to deal with parking. And we've seen this too with transportation network companies like Lyft and Uber. And so we see some trips becoming more common, maybe even public transit more often because it's less expensive right now than TNCs and maybe in the future for a while. I really do expect to see transit take over this market to some extent because they already have far more money than this is going to cost. I think transit agencies spend about $3 per passenger mile right now, in addition to the, I don't know, 50 cents or so that passengers are paying for a lot of those transit trips. So transit provision is very expensive, and those agencies have a big budget to tap to either contract these services out or deliver directly. So I also am very concerned about that empty travel and people thinking they might just buy one vehicle and then have it go pick up everybody throughout the day and take care of all of a household's trip making, which would mean, you know, potentially 50% empty travel, which is ridiculous given the congestion levels that we have in all of our urban areas pretty much everywhere in the world. So we really can't sustain that. And on average across the US, these people are suggesting, yeah, it'd be fine to maybe have 20% of the travel be empty. Doesn't matter whether it's a privately owned vehicle. I think it should be 0% on the privately owned vehicles unless it's a true emergency. And SAAV fleets, I actually think that they should be allowed to go about 20% empty, because our simulations suggest that's all they need to serve even a region with plenty of rural locations in it. That would be all they need to do. And then when they do the ride sharing between strangers, they can actually reduce total VMT as though they have nothing going empty, although there will always be empty. But by putting people together, they can bring that total VMT, or vehicle miles traveled, down. About 25% of Americans feel that any kind of empty travel should be banned or heavily tolled. It really should be discouraged dramatically and perhaps simply not allowed. So some people are aware of the real issues, whether they're environmental or congestion. So we use all that data to simulate those households moving forward over time, what kind of vehicles they'll be owning and what year, and how much they'll be using them, either in the shared fleets or their own private fleets. And we take lots of regression models. So these are parameter estimates from multinomial logits and ordered probits, weighted least squares, and other specifications, depending on what the response variable is. And the response variables are things like, when do they release a vehicle or acquire a vehicle as part of their household fleet, how much they would use an SAV, how much distance they might be traveling by different modes, and then the powertrain that they choose on any new homes, or new vehicles, I should say. And then finally, the home location. We're very concerned about sprawl. Every time in our history that we've made travel easier, we've seen cities grow significantly. And of course, there's always that population pressure and that wealth pressure, creating sprawl around American cities and many other cities in the world. But this is a whole new technology for travel that could really open that Pandora's box again for us. So we did ask questions about that, and we were kind of relieved that people didn't seem very excited to move further away from the central business districts. We simulated all of that for 6 scenarios that involved prices falling on AVs and having that human driving option on the new sales of AVs. So they're not AVs only, they can be driven, and they still have steering wheels and brakes and acceleration pedals. And then a 7th scenario that I'll show you in a second. So here's what the microsimulation looks like. This is at the household level, year after year. We start with an existing household and millions of existing households across the US to reflect the whole population. And we're running different models along the way, including the buy and sell and lease decisions, and which vehicle they let go of, and which powertrain they use, including diesel, hybrids, plug-in hybrids, and battery-only electric vehicles, how much they're willing to pay for the automation in addition to that new vehicle or that used vehicle, and whether it's greater than the price premium that Detroit is charging at that time on their vehicles. And then the moving decision, whether they might move further away from or closer to the city center for their region. And finally, the vehicle miles traveled decisions by modes and vehicles within their fleet. So we do this for each household every year and move forward. We don't age the households, we don't divorce them or give them new children to take care of or anything like that. So we're hands off on the demographics here. We also don't allow people to really change in terms of their preferences, except that over time, we have seen people more willing to pay for new technologies like your cell phone. 10 years ago, you would have thought that thing is worth a lot less than you think it is today to your life. And so that does happen with many things. People kind of get locked in to a preference, and we'll see that happen with these vehicles. So looking forward to 2 different years, 2035 and 2050, we've got the percentage of vehicles owned by households that are AVs versus HVs, so autonomous versus human-driven capabilities and only. So the AVs may be both modes. They have a human driving option on them, but they are able to go fully self-driving. And the percentages are not that remarkable. The most optimistic scenario is when we drop the price of that AV technology, starting at like $70,000 a year or something. We dropped it 10% per year, which does happen with new technologies. 5% and 7.5% are also common drops on cell phones and things like that to maintain the same quality of technology over time. So what usually happens is the technology actually gets better, so you don't notice the big price drops. We also have that idea of whether the vehicle can be driven in human mode, and so that increases adoption, although not necessarily use, right? So it can always be driven in human mode, so more people buy the AV, and it still has a steering wheel, and so they may not use it as an AV very much of the time. And the most optimistic case is that 84%, which is all the way in 2050, of course, and that's with the 10% per year decline and the HV capabilities. So many of those AVs are not being driven as AVs all the time. So that HV option does increase the share of AV capable vehicles out there. And then the pricing decline assumptions were key from what we could see across the different kinds of scenarios we were testing. But of course, there's that seventh scenario. So that's shown here. It's this orange line, and that's where we said in 2035, the feds put a ban on sales of human-driven vehicles. So there's no more dual mode option. You can only buy a fully autonomous vehicle in that year going forward. And that's because of the ethical issue of allowing people to run into other people and cause a lot of property damage, injuries, and of course, deaths. So this is a big killer. Cars have gotten safer. They're still killing pedestrians and bicyclists, though, as you're probably drunk or very distracted or fatigued, especially late at night. You've got a lot of deaths happening still on the roadways. So not allowing that kind of death, but of course these vehicles will still make mistakes. So there will still be issues where things come flying out at them and there's no chance to react, things like that. But because of the ethics, I really do think the feds will be banning human-driven vehicles at some point in this country and elsewhere. And so that ban, even though it's happening with a 5% price drop per year on the automation technology, not the base price of the vehicle, just the automation technology, that brings that adoption rate in 2050 up to match the optimistic case scenario, which is the dark blue line. So neither one is at 100%. You're still just at 85%, I'm afraid. So I do think there will be other things happening along the way, like people encouraging neighbors and friends and family to buy these things, and people getting used to being able to take care of business en route. So they're using the automation more and more rather than thinking that they're going to drive 2/3 of the time. I also think cities like Austin and Los Angeles will probably put an HV ban around their downtowns or any places they have high pedestrian deaths and things like that. And that will encourage more and more adoption. Some of the state DOTs may make lanes exclusive for AVs, like the Highway 1 corridor across California, or Interstate 1 to, I think, is it I-10, maybe I should say, that takes you from LA up to San Francisco and Sacramento or something, and I-80, they may decide to ban self-driving, or human driving, excuse me, in some of those lanes. And that will encourage faster adoption. Detroit is also really important in all of this, right? Their pricing decisions, their vehicle body type decisions, and that will have huge ramifications. And of course, Toyota and Tesla and all of those manufacturers that don't have headquarters in Detroit, very important to how this rolls out. So mileage splits are more important than what's in the driveway every night of people's homes. So what's really on the road for passenger travel in the year 2050 and 2035? And that's what this slide is about. So we've got SAVs in this slide now. You'll see 4 columns devoted to SAVs, and there's the SAVs that are driven with dynamic ride sharing. So there's a stranger in the car with you versus privately traveled, I guess, you booked the whole car to yourself, so there's no stranger in there with you. And that's about a 1/3, 2/3 split between the ride sharing and the private, SAV vehicle. And then most of the driving is getting done in the privately owned AVs, assuming that Americans can get their hands on those. A lot of manufacturers probably don't want to sell to you and me anytime soon. They want to sell to very professionally managed fleet owners, and those folks will be signing lengthy contracts. They will be updating software regularly. They will be checking sensors daily, if not twice a day. They'll be doing a lot of things that you and I have no interest in doing and cannot promise to do well. So the most, I guess, optimistic cases get us to maybe 57% in a privately held AV. So that's the mode that's being driven, the mileage in the year 2050, and then another 25% in an SAV, which cannot be human driven at all. But we still have, the privately held cars that are human driving only, and they're still there all the way through 2050, even with the big price decline case. The AVs are a little bit younger or newer than the HVs, so they do tend to drive more per vehicle, as you probably know. If you have a household with 2 or more vehicles, the newer vehicles tend to be driven more heavily. So we have all that factored into this microsimulation. Anyhow, it is clear that Americans would like to be able to buy these things rather than just rent them. But I think the manufacturers are going to be key here, and I think they're probably going to be renting them only and not letting them drive in snowstorms and things like that. And of course, if you buy an AV, it probably will shut down or make you sign off on a screen for all sorts of damages if you decide to take it out when it doesn't feel its sensors are working properly or the roads are not well mapped, things like that. I do think we're going to need proactive policies to limit that empty driving, especially from privately owned AVs, and the congestion impacts from just a 5% increase in vehicle miles traveled are pretty severe at peak times of day in most of our cities. Certainly LA and Austin have a lot of congestion, so you will notice that dramatically. When you guys get out of classes, for example, the whole area, in school, K through C, the road's flowing very differently.
Cara?
The price, yes.
We had a little data problem, and so that last sentence got mangled. If you could repeat it.
I'm trying to think. Well, I mentioned that when you guys aren't in school, and of course when K through 12 children are not in school, congestion is much lesser. It's pretty notable when you guys are not in school, especially younger people. So you'll see that with a 5% increase from AVs is going to be very notable as well in the wrong direction. But the price drops on the AVs and that willingness to pay to retain human driving option are pretty key to the adoption rates as well as how the vehicles are used in the future. And then the supply is going to be really important. And we did not simulate what Detroit is going to do. So which vehicles they'll have, we just simulated their price and assumed it was a fully autonomous vehicle with or without a steering wheel. The home locations were not significantly impacted. I didn't tell you what those survey results were, but I'll tell you now, about 7% of people thought they would move closer to the central business district with these kinds of technologies because they are willing to maybe get rid of their own vehicles. They don't need as much land for that, and they can rely on other modes in addition to SAV fleets that maybe go fenced initially, so they may only be serving the corners of our regions initially, especially since we can't mass produce them that quickly. You have to retool those assembly lines, you have to produce one at a time, You have to have really good management. So, and every city wants them. So they're going to be in high demand. It's going to be hard to roll them out. So they probably won't be allowed everywhere. So some people wanting to move back to the city center, and some people, of course, wanting to move further. They're thinking, I'll just sleep on my way to work. My kids can take a robo-taxi to get to a private school, and we can live wherever we want now, buy horses and golf horses or whatever. And so about 8% were thinking they would move further out. It'll be interesting to see how this progresses. As I mentioned before, we did not model any changes in demographics. And of course, we have an aging population. So, and we do have a rising population. So those two things can impact congestion as well as demand. So that was part one. Part two is about shared autonomous vehicles. So is part three, and the part four, these are those fleets I was talking about, of self-driving and using that car sharing mode. Some of you are members of car sharing, and that's fantastic. Some of you have taken rides in self-driving vehicles, and certainly the elevator is a self-driving vehicle we've all been in. And society was quite nervous when they got rid of elevator operators, which none of you will ever recall. You're way too young, and I wasn't around either for that, but that was a scary thing, to let elevators be self-driving. So you may or may not know that most vehicles are seated at almost all times of day. The busiest time of day is 5 to 6 p.m. and only maybe 12% of vehicles are in use at that time of day. If you add buffers to the vehicle trips that are being taken, to imagine a vehicle, once it's been used by me, going to go pick up somebody else and take care of them. So it's a 5-minute buffer at the pickup and a 5-minute buffer at the end. You still cannot break 20% of vehicles in use. So this makes it sound like, well, we could get rid of 80% of our vehicles, right? If we just share them, we could get rid of 80% of our vehicles. And of course, car sharing programs have expanded quickly. There's still a very minor part of them around the UCLA campus. But they, you know, people do have experience with that. The problem is you have to walk to them, and you don't know if the vehicle will be there when you want to go home from the party or go home from shopping or work, wherever it was that you had used a vehicle to get to. And so the SAVs help get rid of that anxiety about return trip certainty and of course that cost of accessing the vehicle because it can come to you. So we started small. This is Dan Fagnan's work. He coded a simple town, basically a 10-mile by 10-mile area with roads every quarter mile in the north, south, and east-west directions. And then he generated trips using based K and OP counts, much like the central part of Austin. So sort of taking the average density of trip making around the 10-mile by 10-mile central portion of Austin, giving, of course, higher rates to the city center, but making it very symmetric. So even though that picture doesn't look symmetric, that's because it's random for a 24-hour day, but it does assume sort of a land use symmetry around the region, which Austin doesn't have. And then mostly round trip travel, because most people do return. And so we needed to know how long they might spend at their destination. And we used the National Household Travel Survey data for that, as well as trip distances and times of day at which they're departing and that kind of thing. So we just grabbed existing data to make it look like real travel. And we didn't actually allow for congestion to be endogenous. We assumed travel speed. So we basically assumed travel times between every point in this lattice. And we allowed the matching of trips with people to happen every 5 minutes. So we didn't have to keep track of the fleet every second the way Uber and Lyft do it. And that allowed us to just kind of progress with the simulation. And here's one vehicle traveling around this 10-mile by 10-mile region. You see these 2-mile by 2-mile neighborhoods that are kind of bolded with their outline. And this vehicle, the blue lines are either picking up somebody and then taking him or her to the destination, and the red lines are a proactive relocation process where the vehicle's idling and asking, should I move to a better zone? Should I move to a better 2-mile by 2-mile neighborhood? Because 2-mile by 2-mile neighborhoods seem to be kind of the best boundary use in terms of relocation rather than a very local search, maybe a search. And this particular vehicle served about 35 trips that day. They were short trips because this is a small town and the vehicles were not allowed to exit. It ended at about where it started, which is strange. That's not typical. But, you know, 35 trips in one day, that's about 10 times as hard as our cars work, or, you know, 10 and a half times as, 10 point something times as hard as most of our cars tend to work each day. With a little bit of relocation, which adds some empty travel, but maybe makes the wait times shorter for the next traveler. So that's what we were looking at with the relocation decisions. And that was just one vehicle. We simulated thousands, as you can imagine, and eventually, you know, hundreds of thousands of trips being served. We did it for hundreds of days, and we had lots of different assumptions on speeds and things like that. But across these different simulations, we were finding that one SAV for this small town could kind of replace about 10 personal household vehicles. But, you know, you couldn't leave, so that's a little too generous. That 1 to 10 is too generous because these trips are too short to represent true American travel in cars. The average wait time was about 0.3 minutes, and we added another 2.5 minutes to that to make this about 2.8 total, because we only allowed people to be allocated a vehicle at the 5-minute mark. So we were working on a 5-minute time step. But it was still under 3 minutes, even recognizing that people could truly call in and would call in at any point in that 5-minute interval. So very short wait times, relatively low empty travel going on, even with the relocations that we were using. And even though there was empty travel, because we used a right-sized fleet, we used like a Toyota Camry instead of, you know, I don't know, some kind of SUV that a lot of Americans buy, especially out here in Texas. We were still getting reductions in greenhouse gases and volatile organic compounds, and especially in VOCs and carbon monoxide. We were seeing like a 50% reduction in those emissions. And a big part of the reason the VOCs and the carbon monoxide go down is because those cold starts are avoided. So your engine is starting warm. A warm engine is also a more efficient engine, so you do get better fuel economy if your car's been driving for a while. There's also less embodied roads. We don't save anything there. You probably need more roads in some way because these things are driving more. They're very busy. These cars are working like 8 to 10 hours a day rather than your car, which works about 1 hour a day. So they're very busy. They're traveling just as much, probably more than private household fleet, but they're able to save on emissions because they're not big vehicles and they're not letting their engines get cold. So we took it up a notch. Dan went ahead and coded this for a much more realistic region. It was still not a huge region. This is a 12-mile by 24-mile region. And this is the Austin core. So you see the I35 pattern right there, north-south with that red series of dots. And you see a network that is definitely not a grid. And so he's also still using travel times that have been decided in advance. He's not allowing for congestion due to the SAVs, so it's congested, you know, in the afternoons and in the mornings, in the middle of the day, and he's using those travel times depending on what time of day that car is moving between each origin and destination. He's also allowing ride sharing here, okay? So if the trip seemed really efficient to bring an extra traveler on board, or maybe a third traveler on board as well. So 3 strangers traveling together, he did it. And he just assumed that the price difference would be strong enough to compel people, and the wait time would not be more than about 5 minutes additional, except for the long trips where it might be, you know, up to, I don't know, 10% or 15% of total travel time might be increased by deciding to share, but you save money. So here is another example of a vehicle, in this case sort of Euclidean distances flying between points in a busy day. About 30 trips served on this vehicle's day for this fleet. This is just one example vehicle, but there's, you know, tens of thousands like it in his simulation. And you can see down below where it is in the course of the day. It does have quiet times where it might be able to recharge if it's an electric vehicle, and it's generally not going to need to refuel until the nighttime. if it's a conventional, gas-fueled vehicle. So these vehicles are traveling about 250 miles a day. And so, my Prius can handle 2 of those days before it needs refueling. But my Tesla, the Model 3, the latest one, that's the less expensive one, that has a 215-mile range. So I'm probably going to have to charge it to serve all these trips, once or twice a day on average. So he had gradually brought up the number of trips he was serving in that region. It's a core region. He still had excellent wait times, averaging less than 3 minutes. He had random, trip patterns. So we tried to also simulate really busy days and really quiet days. So Thanksgiving, I think, is kind of a quiet day, but there's some long trips that take place on Thanksgiving. Other days, really busy, like a Friday, I don't know, in September, very busy. And so he simulated those to see how a single fleet decision, you buy a set of vehicles, how that would hold up. And it did quite well. The fleet size decision was pretty stable, regardless of whether you were serving a busy LA, Friday or a quiet LA holiday. And with the dynamic ride sharing, which is that second column of this 3-column table, the dynamic ride sharing brought down the need for vehicles. So it gave us, again, like almost a 1 to 10 vehicle replacement rate. Very low wait times, although longer than when you don't have the dynamic ride sharing, because they're trying to figure out what other person to match with you maybe and bring you a vehicle with somebody already in it sometimes. But even, in the worst time of day, which is 5 to 6 in the evening, you're still got a really low wait time for those people. And we ended up, in some of our scenarios, actually reducing vehicle miles traveled, but here in these 2 specific examples, it went up about 5% when you had ride sharing and about 8% without the dynamic ride sharing. So not a ton of ride sharing, but certainly do it where it's efficient. It helps reduce the need for vehicle replace expensive, and this system offered really high returns, so like a 20% profit if you're charging just $1 per mile, and that's assuming that the technology on top of a base vehicle is about $20,000 or $25,000 to acquire. We then started testing electric vehicles, so that was Donna Chen's work, and we did a short range, like a 60-mile vehicle, so we can call that the Leaf. It's a very old Leaf. Leafs get a lot more range now, and then a 200-mile range vehicle, which would be like an older Model S, or my Model 3 aged, because I get about 215 miles range on the Model 3 that I purchased. We also assumed inductive charging there and a much bigger region, again with a grid. So this was still using that old code, and then the dynamic ride sharing, of course, was saving emissions and in some cases helping actually reduce total VMT, but not a lot. And that's versus business as usual, which is very inefficient, the way Americans travel in terms of ride sharing, of course, very inefficient. And so now we're going to move to the whole region. This is a 6-county region. This is a 2 million person Austin region, and this is work done by Ben Loeb. So we're taking the shared idea plus, the self-driving vehicle and this inductive or robotic arm for charging the vehicle, so that you don't need to pay a human to sit there waiting for an electric vehicle to arrive so that you can plug it in physically with your hand. Those are not yet being sold en masse in the market, but we do expect them. And of course, you can charge your phone inductively, but these bigger pads, they're not really selling them just yet. So we're hoping to see those very soon. These are called SAEVs because they're all electric, but we're going to compare to a hybrid fleet, like a fleet of Priuses, and see how they compete. Because they are all electric, they're not hybrids, and they do require a plug-in of some sort. We have to figure out where those stations are. So that makes the algorithm for creating this fleet more complex. And basically what we did in those sort of orangish blocks there, we decided whether the vehicles that were out there could serve the calls that were coming in, and if a call couldn't be served, we created a new station right at that stranded vehicle's location, basically. A electric vehicle couldn't serve that trip and take that person all the way to her destination. So we created a station just for that vehicle and allowed it to start charging. Once we did this, we had a little too many stations, as you can imagine, so we kept running the station, kept running with those stations. The bat on it again, and the fleet was able to survive. Nobody got stranded, which was great. So I hope you're able to hear me. I know that the connection's a little bit unstable here. This is a Wi-Fi connection for me. I'm on my laptop.
Yeah, we lost you a little bit, but I think we got the gist of the sentence.
Yeah. When I see that warning, I stop talking for a moment there to let it break. So here's two examples of the Austin region. That's the I35 Corridor, which goes from Mexico to Canada, going right through the heart of Austin. And the stations you can see in the pink are for one of the vehicles, either the Leaf or the Tesla, and the stations in the purple are for the other vehicle. So I want you to think which one is for the Tesla and which one is for the Leaf. You can probably guess that you don't need as many stations for the Tesla. So the 200-mile range fleet is on the left and the 60-mile range fleet is on the right. But if I were doing this, I would use the right side image for my stations regardless of whether I had a 200 or even a 300-mile range vehicle serving in this fleet, because I would not want my EVs chasing down those stations. They're going to spend a lot of time and distance going to those pink stations. Much better to have a station close to you. It'll be a smaller station, a cheaper station. And so if you can, build more stations and just make them smaller. Here's what it looks like downtown. For those of you who've been to downtown Austin, we have the Colorado River running through. I guess one of the Colorado rivers that exists in the US runs right through Austin. And so these are little stations that may need just a couple inductive charging pads or maybe one charging pad. It really depends. You have to look at the simulation results to see that, how these should be sized. Some of them, of course, will be bigger. I think along I35 there, that's going to be a bigger station. And those stations can be moved around. You don't need to have them right where the car got stranded. It was just a random simulation. It can be moved several blocks to a cheap, ugly piece of land and create your little cheap station there. It also depends on power transmission and things like that, depending on the rate at which you want to charge. So that's about as dense as it got for serving these vehicles. If you have a bigger fleet and you're serving more and more of the population, you can just make your stations bigger. You don't have to have more of them in this expensive real estate in downtown Austin. And here's the table where I'm going to show you different scenarios. So we use the Prius as an SAV, and that's going to be that first column that's kind of hidden there. It's called the hybrid SAV column in gray. And then we've got 5 all-electric vehicle fleets, one that charges slowly, so it takes 240 minutes to charge, and it's short range. It only goes 60 miles, like that old Leaf I was talking about. The fast chargers take 30 minutes, you can see that in red, to fully charge. So a lot of the vehicles pulling in do not need a full charge. They can get out of there in 15 minutes. And of course, the fastest charging happens at the beginning and through most of the charging duration, but towards the end you have to be very careful with that battery. So if you're going to get close to a full charge, you have to slow down your charging rate. But 30 minutes total, but you can get a lot of that charge in 15 minutes, more than half. And the range, we also have the 200-mile range vehicle in there. And my preferred fleet is that yellow column with the fast charge and the long range. That's the only fleet that's able to compete with the hybrid fleet. So it serves almost all trips. It does have to turn away about 2.67% of trips because the wait time was more than 30 minutes for those people. And the hybrid fleet also had to turn away some people. It turned away 1.62%. So that's the unserved trips. They both served about 28 trips a day in this 6-county region. This is a big region, you guys. It's got lots of rural areas in it. Very exurban areas, things like that. So lots of low density sprawling and uninhabited areas. And so we're trying to serve everybody. But of course, you can price it so that you weed out sort of the tough trips to serve. I don't know, maybe some weird industrial sites for destinations. They have to call ahead and pre-book with somebody else in order to get a vehicle. But most trips are not hard to meet, especially if you're willing to wait or pre-book. And then the average wait times are about 5 minutes. So now we actually have a software that is working every second to consider matches. It's not perfect. It's not probably as good as Uber and Lyft have, but we are doing the best we can. Pretty simple heuristics, and we're getting an average wait time of about 5 minutes. But downtown, it's about 2 minutes. And you see that with Uber and Lyft too. When you're in downtowns, they've got amazing match times. We do have some unoccupied travel, about 6%. So this is pretty low. This was great. And then, he does allow dynamic ride sharing in this. So fleet size is really important. That last column was actually a smaller fleet where we cheaped out. We used the same number of stations for all of these electric vehicles because we didn't want that to be a deciding factor in whether we go with the long range or the short range. But we did cheap out at the end, and we reduced the fleet size by about 20%. And of course, that increased the wait times quite a lot, as well as the percentage of unserved trips. But, on a busy day, it might feel like that. It might feel like you've cheaped out on fleet size on a very busy Friday. Okay, so the next thing we did was we tried to estimate the cost of providing this kind of service. And so you have to get the batteries in the vehicles, you have to replace the batteries once per lifetime was the assumption, you have to maintain all the vehicles, of course, including the Priuses, if you're gonna go with those. You have insurance and registration, you have back office charges to administer the whole system, which is expensive, okay? So people aren't taking care of their own vehicles with their own time. You have to have managers and people taking phone calls and things like that. Lots of staff to do this. And then you have to buy the properties for those stations, and you might have to buy a fast charger, which is not cheap. Prices will come down, but they're not gonna go past $10,000, which was our low end assumption. And of course, you have to pay for the kilowatt hours. So once we did that, this is the mid-cost assumption. We ended up with about 59 cents per mile, revenue miles. So there's a passenger, at least one passenger inside the vehicle for the EVs, and 45 cents a mile for the HEV. So that's the hybrid or Prius electric vehicle. It's not a plug-in. It's just a gasoline vehicle with a very efficient motor attached to an engine. So electric drive with, of course, gasoline. And that 45 cents is really close to the 44 cents I was telling you guys earlier as being the current sort of average that Americans are willing to pay. There's no profit on this number, but you can imagine that that's kind of an interesting correspondence. And unfortunately, the electric vehicle fleets are more expensive, but we're really impressed with how Tesla batteries are performing. Maybe we won't have to replace those batteries. And then the maintenance costs on EVs tend to be lower because they don't need their brake pads. They're regenerating a lot of that energy. So there's a lot of benefits to an electric vehicle that might reduce some of these costs. So just to conclude, there's lots of benefits I didn't talk about in terms of safety and getting people, who don't have driver's licenses to destinations quickly, and maybe reducing the needs for parking if, the fleets are shared, but the vehicle miles traveled and thus the congestion is a real issue. So is the energy. So we really hope that they're going to be electric. We really hope that they're going to be right-sized. So that's a shared fleet. Mostly there can be some pickups in there. There can be some SUVs, but mostly they should be compacts, and sedans with low coefficients of drag and electric drivetrains, things like that. And unless you have strong pricing incentives, which may be road pricing, it's dynamic ride sharing is not going to save you. You have to really push it through some of the pricing incentives or the pricing penalties. And then there could be amazing travel cost savings as well as emissions benefits. And for our transit providers, if they get on board, there could be some real money saving or profit making, I suppose. They're not supposed to make a profit, but real money saving opportunities for them. I do think because of the added demand that we're going to see, I just talked about the empty travel from a fleet. I didn't talk about all the added demand that's going to come. I mean, people are going to stop flying between San Francisco and LA as often, and they're going to take to the road. And you're going to have elderly people making more trips at night and during the daytime. You're going to have a lot more trip making, and people may be abusing this technology. So I think congestion pricing is needed, but it should be credit-based, so everybody has a budget, basically, of like $4 a month to spend on those congestion tolls. The vehicles know where they are. They can keep track of what they owe, and they can be audited randomly, but they don't need to share all that position information with Big Brother unless they get audited, because it's a random thing, or you're concerned that they are showing up too much in photographs on your fleet, on your network, and they're not paying something that would be consistent with all those images at peak times a day. So anyhow, I really appreciate you're allowing me to present this remotely, and there's a lot of work at our website in case you're interested. And of course, I would love to take some questions now.
Okay, can we make her full screen? And I think she can see you on that camera. So if anyone wants to be the innovator here and raise their hand, let's see if.
You can pick, Brian, on who's going to ask the questions.
Okay, I'm going to start with the question. You had talked about zero occupant vehicle trips, and a lot of concern about that. I'm wondering if in the simulations that you do you account for chauffeuring trips and whether that's necessarily better off? So in other words, if someone picks up an elderly parent and takes them to the doctor, is that somehow a better use of a vehicle trip than a vehicle taking that person to the doctor? Or a parent taking their kid to soccer practice, or someone getting dropped off at LAX, or a lot of the chauffeuring trips that might go on. Is the fact that there's an operator in the vehicle for a part of the time make it somehow morally superior to one where it would be empty if it's essentially a chauffeuring trip? And have you accounted for that in any way? And are you frozen on the screen?
I think she's frozen.
No, I agree that there are a lot of wasteful trips out there.
So did you account for that in you talked about the zero vehicle trips? I mean, it seems to me that there'd also be zero occupant trips that would be generated, but some of those would be replacing chauffeuring trips, and I don't know if they counting, that would double count sort of the.
Of course, no. You're absolutely right. A lot of us parents, and of course people taking care of elders or friends who don't have cars or something, are driving wastefully. And it's interesting to me that in Seattle and New York City and stuff, they're complaining so much about these TNCs adding VMT to their networks, and of course San Francisco. But a lot of that VMT is coming from the vehicles actually being owned remotely and driving in from like a low rent city for the driver to come into San Francisco and then start traveling around. So his starting trip and his ending trip on both ends of the day are adding maybe some VMT. And of course he is driving empty a fair bit. It's hard to share trips when they're short sometimes. But in any case, you're absolutely right. There is an opportunity to save VMT from no longer having to serve passengers that way. And so we haven't looked at that. It's a great topic. I think we have some data we could guess at it. And I just haven't seen any good guesses yet. And I, of course, am listening to all this debate about the added VMT that TNCs are having on some of our regions.
Okay, so I broke the ice. Yes, in the back. First of all, really project, because you've got to go to that microphone up there. Yeah.
We visited one of the local bus lines recently. They're moving to electric charging, but that's going to have a big impact on the power grid. Is it a concern to have like a lot of these charging stations maybe coincide with this move towards electrification or like things like that?
I can't hear everything she's saying, but she's worried about the power grid from the
I'll
SAEVs
try.
charging, especially fast.
Yeah, I'll try and paraphrase. No, the question was we'd gone to a new bus facility in Los Angeles where they're looking now at converting to an all-electric fleet. And one of the issues is whether the grid at that location can handle the charging that would be required for the fleet. And what she was asking, I think, is have you taken that into consideration as to whether and there's research here done by Jared DeShaza that suggests where the charging station is can have highly differential effects on the grid, and that those are
Yeah.
sort of random choices. And have you accounted for that at all in your analysis?
So a lot of it is the transformers and what they've been designed to handle. And, you know, American energy demand is actually falling in a lot of ways because of LEDs and other efficiencies. So we're not really building big capacity like China is, as they add refrigerators and things like that. And a lot of our grid operators would love another reason to be able to sell power on the grid, but those strong spikes from buses are pretty serious, and so you do need to be very careful where you put those. The smaller vehicles, not so much, but any big charging station like a Tesla multi-bay charging station does have to site itself carefully, and that can vary block by block. So in San Francisco, for example, or downtown LA, wherever you have big industry and you have multi-story buildings for businesses, they generally already have very high levels of power that they can deliver. And then you have to be really careful the way you demand power, because if you spike once a month, you're going to be held at that price per kilowatt hour for the whole month typically. And so that involves some time of use pricing. You as residents don't pay that, but commercial entities do. And so the pricing becomes really important, not just whether the grid is going to become unstable. I don't think the grid is going to become unstable with SAEVs, but buses can demand a lot more. That's a really big battery pack. And, you know, it may just be one bus or two buses, but that's still a lot more than, let's say, 10 SAEVs. Most of these SAEVs are going to get most of their charge at night, unless you go with a really small battery pack, like 100 miles, which I cannot recommend. So I'm recommending the 200 mile for sure, if you want to be able to compete with a more conventional vehicle like a hybrid Prius. But yeah, I wouldn't be worried about this. I do think if you do have a concern like those buses, the other thing that they do, and especially to protect themselves from price surges, is to keep a battery on the side and to listen to the network. So we need communications with the power network, because at certain times of day, the clouds are shifted, the sun is strong, you've got all these renewables, and they're being dumped if we're not using them. And so we have a new paper on our website about electric buses with smart charging, and so it's a great use. Is just listen, and you can save the grid operator a lot of money by listening to when wind is high, when sun is high, you know, and it's not just looking at the sun. You do need to listen to the grid and how it's being used, and that's will help make better use of renewables, keep prices down for everybody. So, but you do also have that, you know, on the site battery pack, and California and Hawaii do that because energy is so expensive in both those states. So I hope that answers your question. Don't worry about SAEVs. E-buses, yeah, it can be a problem, but they're big enough that they really should be talking to the grid and hearing when they can power and save a lot of money while still serving those passengers and not running out of charge.
Okay. Yes. Questions here. We start here. Work our way back.
Okay. So
Nice and loud for the microphone.
There seems like to be like a lot of good into shared autonomous vehicles, as well as like shared autonomous vehicles that are battery powered rather than gas powered. And I can see why some transportation standards goals can align with automated vehicles. But I still see some points of concern. For example, like we want to have these vehicles that are electric to decarbonize, but to decarbonize, you also have to lower your consumption. And that includes producing these vehicles. So we want to, decarbonize also means not having to adopt these vehicles at a grand scale, because that will also contribute to our carbon emissions in one way or another. In terms of safety, we see that pedestrian collisions are caused mainly by a disconnect between large arterial roads and mainly low-income people of color who usually walk a lot and are being struck by these by cars because of the street design that we have, thanks to transportation engineers. And then we're also saying, in the grand scheme of things internationally, I wouldn't be surprised if Bolivia became the next Iraq. So in the grand scheme of things, how or why should transportation planners take shared autonomous vehicles seriously, or to what scale can they do these things good without furthering inequities and that are produced by cars, either human-driven or autonomous?
Because Americans are pigs. We overconsume all sorts of things. I mean, we're just bad actors in lots of ways, and you're not going to be able to change the desire to move quickly between destinations and origins. So I used to take the bus, and then I have kids. Have you had kids yet? It is life-changing. It is so influential in terms of your location choice and your destination choices and the times of day and the constraints you have on that time. So you're going to really appreciate a car or an electric bike or something. I do think electric bikes are way far preferable. Weather is an issue. Clothing and attire, so you have to get people in businesses to change, how they dress. Women have to become less vain about their hair, including yours truly. So there's a lot of behavioral issues that we absolutely need to be addressing at the same time. I'm just saying, if we let Americans continue to do something similar to what they're doing right now, and that's not what I would espouse. I'm just saying, how can we make it less awful? Okay, so SAEVs, right-sizing vehicles, absolutely important. The self-driving will reduce those losses of people of color and others who are getting hit. And yeah, these are really serious concerns. I mean, congestion is nothing compared to crash costs. Crash costs are like $3,000 a year per person in this country. Even though many of you have never been in a collision, they are bad when they happen. I have several students that are in pain for life because of being hit. They weren't killed, but it is a real tragedy. And so, and they were hit inside cars, and they were hit while on scooters. I mean, they're hit in all sorts of settings. So crashes are really serious, and there's a big benefit there. It also is a loss of time to be sitting there driving, So I don't want to encourage driving. So that's why I've always, for 20 years now, been looking at credit-based congestion pricing as a solution to that kind of issue. And this new technology helps us keep track of where the vehicles are, so you don't need those ugly gantries over your highways with kind of RFID tags and things like that. So there's, this technology enables some other good things, but you're right, electric bikes are way better.
Okay.
Could you talk a little bit more about the policy environment and what cities could or should be doing to prepare for AVs?
Yeah, there's not much they need to do. I mean, the manufacturers know that these vehicles have to go between cities. They have to go between states. So they have to be able to do a lot. They're not going to be designed to go off-road. So if you have a ranch, you're probably going to have another vehicle there or something if you really want to drive around off-road. And of course, if you really like to drive in snowy conditions or something, well, you'll have to figure something out. But cities don't really have to do much. One city recently, a small city, put up some signs that said a stopping location for autonomous vehicles or shared ride sharing in autonomous vehicles, just to be cute. So they're signaling, we want you here, please come to our small city. But those manufacturers and technologists are going to come to where it's most convenient, which might be a Phoenix suburb, or it might be Austin or Mountain View, these kinds of things. There's really not much they need to be doing, although the manufacturers would like that.
Quick follow-up. There's no responsibility for sort of intelligent infrastructure in relationship to vehicles and managing connected fleets?
No, so there's different ideas of connection. So these vehicles will be connected to their fleet managers, let's say. One thing they really want to do is be able to remotely drive the vehicle if it doesn't know what to do. So they don't want to hand it off to me to drive, and they don't want to have a steering wheel in there. So they need to be able to remotely drive cars that are getting in trouble because of weird conditions, let's say. So that, they thought 5G communications technology would be helpful there. But a connected vehicle is a very different thing. It's simply a vehicle that's reporting its position with centimeter level accuracy ideally, and its direction and speed and maybe deceleration rate. So that helps signal to others that can't maybe see you super easily, but are within radar hearing. And usually they do require line of sight, by the way, which is a problem. So that's DSRC. And that was supposed to happen. If Hillary had been elected, we probably would have that required on the model year 2021 passenger vehicles, or light duty vehicles, I should say, like, let's say passenger cars, all light duty vehicles. And then I think on heavy duties, it would have been model year 2022. But that's really cheap. That's about $50 if you put it in on the assembly line. And it's just basically telling people where you are. It's not hard to do. And they decided to wait, I guess, because Trump was elected, and also the 5G guys say, let's just wait for 5G, which hasn't been as exciting as we were hoping. We were hoping to have more bandwidth with the 5G.
There's a question over here. Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about AVs and urban freight and logistics, and whether or not there's greater opportunity there as opposed to just ordering people?
Did you hear that question?
No.
It was. Can you talk to us about AVs and urban freight and logistics, and what its promise and potential or pitfalls are relative to passenger movement? Is that a?
Yeah. So. I guess, they have the same issues of congestion, and then there's electrification too, which is important there for deliveries. Those are a good option. Some cities may not allow diesel, and so electrification is pretty important for the heavy duties, and then the medium duties, which do a lot of the deliveries. I think when we simulate the impact of self-driving on trade, we see it's mostly for the longer corridors, because you still need an operator on board for pickups and drop-offs and things that may happen along the way. It's a very expensive piece of equipment, so you might have that operator doing other activities while en route, and those might be back office activities, so you can fire other staff that isn't with the vehicle. So that's long distance trades, but they, mostly benefits. So the price of adding the automation is mostly beneficial. You can keep the vehicle moving much like, 23 hours a day rather than with these work hour limitations on your drivers. So you could keep the vehicle moving much longer. But for local stuff, I don't really see it that much, except, all these burrito deliveries that unfortunately are happening as we bring the price of delivery down, could be handled better, maybe with little robots on sidewalks, or people in the shared SAV fleets grabbing your burrito and bringing it to you so that their SAV trip was free. So I'm not sure that there might be a use for these SAVs after hours and during hours with humans doing the last mile or last 100 feet of delivery. So that's all I can imagine. Let me know if you think of more applications. I'd be curious.
Okay. I had just a quick question to put in there, and I don't know whether it's an example of bearing the lead. So this is, most of the people in here are in a class on shared mobility, focusing a lot on public transit, but also on various forms of rise of new mobility. And you had in there on your scenarios you showed at the end that less than 5% of all the VMT was going to be shared under the various scenarios that you had for your full Austin model. We hear one argument that the potential for essentially taking advantage of door-to-door flexibility with private vehicles and the opportunity for sharing with these new systems presents the opportunity to provide something like automobile-like service, but with a much smaller carbon footprint because of the capacity for sharing, less congestion, and allowing to build and develop at higher densities. And yet, you sort of talked about kind of disappointing results, but I did see that 4.5% in shared VMT in your final set of output. Is that the bottom line there? Is that most of this is in your work is likely to be sort of solo travel in these vehicles, or?
So we didn't want to push the traveler around too much. So we only matched them in those scenarios that you saw when it was sufficiently moderate or minor the impact on their total travel time that we figured that this is an easy decision for them to make. When we do behavioral models where we have a mode choice in there and they can pick, then we get about 20% sharing, and we bring our average vehicle occupancies up by like 50%, something like that. So it does get better when we have a mode choice model in there, but sometimes it is very selective on which trips because, you know, of the origin destination densities. And we are starting to simulate stopping points. So we bring the passengers all to these sort of like bus stops, which helps really, you know, they have to get to the bus stop, which is at a time, but once they get there, the probability of matching is much higher. And we're starting to simulate 100% of population, which allows for much better matching because you get this sort of convex increase with the number of people that are using the service and the possibility of a matching. So the probability of a matching goes up. And so my students have only been able to simulate like 10% of the population or 5%. If you get 50% of the population calling these vehicles, then the matching rate is much higher. And you see that with Uber Pool. Uber Pool doesn't match in many cities because it really needs that density to do it properly. Otherwise, you can ask for the match and get a great price, but nobody will actually be matched with you. I also wanted to talk a little bit about transit because I didn't mention the importance of different size vehicles. So you can have sort of very demand responsive transit where there's, you can turn the vehicles on and off depending on the time of day rather than having this union labor driving around for 8 hours in a mostly empty large vehicle that's causing congestion issues and emissions issues if it's diesel for sure. So having mini buses and kind of, and maybe major buses on the very popular corridors and maybe matching up, you know, having people get off and back on. That's a big penalty, by the way. I'm sure you guys know that people associate that with like a $3 penalty to get off of one bus and get on another bus. But these kinds of things are very possible, and we are trying to work on it. These are hard problems.
Okay, over here.
So I had a question about distributional equity when it comes to ensuring that people have access to rides. I mean, obviously there are issues with algorithm bias because algorithms are created by people, and there may be a potential issue with providing accessibility for people coming from specific neighborhoods in different communities. How would you attempt to combat that?
Yeah, well, taxis were notorious, right, for not picking up people just because, you know, it's the wrong time of day or the wrong neighborhood, and TNCs have really done a much better job. I think these kinds of vehicles where they are ordered to go by a central dispatcher and they're it's no longer up to a driver saying, yeah, I'll grab this trip. I don't know who it is. I don't know where they're going, but, you know, I'll grab it. That's much more efficient and equitable. And I think you'll be quite happy about it. I don't think they would code the algorithm not to do that. Of course, demand may be lower in places that, you know, there's lower incomes, and then of course demand may be lower in very high income neighborhoods as well. So it'll be interesting, but I do think equity is probably going to be much improved under these kinds of fleets, especially if the transit providers get involved as well, which I think they should, given how much money they have right now to move us around and how much this is likely to cost.
Okay, we have time for maybe one more question, or we can close it here. Anyone have a burning question to put in? Okay, let's thank Professor Kockelman for taking time to chat with us. Thank you very much. Here, let me come around to. Here we go. Yes, thank you very much for joining in. I think this worked out okay, and I think that we'll all go out and burn those carbon emissions that you save now and traveling about LA. So thank you, thanks a lot, and. Again, she made a generous offer if anybody had specific questions to follow up with her. But, I really appreciate it.
My pleasure, Brian. Thanks, guys. Take care.
Take care.